Welcome to this week's Genealogy Short Takes, Researching Female Ancestors, Getting the Most Out of Obituaries. Historically, women are usually part of what we'll refer to today as realms. Women are first part of their parents' household, generally having their father's surname, and then move to a husband's household with his surname. When beginning to research a female, we often only know one of her surnames, and it can be tough finding records to link her to the second surname. Obituaries are key records to make those connections. Obituaries are very powerful in finding close family members to the deceased. They often define relationships, provide towns of residence, and provide spouses' names. Look for obituaries of the women that you are researching and any family members who would have known the woman. Think about ancestors like parents and grandparents, siblings, descendants, like children and grandchildren, her husband and in-laws, step relations, and even aunts, uncles, nieces, nephews, and cousins. You never know what family members were closest to the woman who you are researching. Obituaries are especially helpful in determining family relationships and finding details about someone's life. When looking through obituaries, be sure to dissect every detail and follow up on clues given. Here are two obituaries that I think are great examples. First, let's look at Mrs. Buge's obituary. Starting out, we have her address, that she's a Webster, New York native, that she was a lifelong member of the Evangelical United Brethren Church of Webster, that the Lots Funeral Home was used, and that she's buried in Webster Rural Cemetery. If one of Elizabeth's daughters was our research subject, these details are also helpful. Her children were likely baptized at the church mentioned, and perhaps they are buried in the same cemetery. Next, let's dissect the obituary so that we can learn more about the family members that are named in the obituary. It states that she has 3 daughters, and it names their husbands. For example, it names Mrs. Lewis with Julie in parentheses, Hyman. It also lists where each of the daughters lived. Julie lived in Penfield. If her daughters were the research subject, we've just linked them to their married realm. 2 sisters are also named, Mrs. Leona Foley of Rochester and Miss Anna Rosenbaum of Walworth. If the deceased, Mrs. Elizabeth Buge, was the research subject, the listing of her sister, Miss Anna Rosenbaum, has likely given us Elizabeth's maiden name, although Anna could be Elizabeth's half or stepsister and have a different surname than Elizabeth. From the obituary, we found the following relatives and relationships. So we have 2 sisters, and we have 4 children, 3 daughters and a son. We didn't get a clue as to Elizabeth's mother, but we do have a clue that her father's surname may be Rosenbaum. Next, Letty Bortle's obituary gives similar information. Her home address, date of death, that she's a Parenton, New York native. She married in May of 1901, was a founder of the Congregational Church in Fairport, that she was buried in Parenton Cemetery, and the Cotton Funeral Home was used. All great leads to finding further records about her. In terms of family relationships, first we see her husband's name, Eugene, and then her stepmother is listed, Mrs. George Bullman. With that listing, it is likely that Bullman is Letty's maiden name, but her stepmother could have remarried. Also, George Bullman may be her father's name. Next, she has 2 half-sisters and 6 half-brothers. Her half-sisters are listed as Mrs. Irene Boyce and Mrs. Martha Moore. So those are their married names. Their locations of residence are listed, and Irene lived in Penn Yan, which is an hour from Victor. So that is a great find to a researcher who may have lost Irene due to a move. Her 6 half-brothers are Byron, Forrest, Glenn, Roy, and Arvid Ellsworth, all of Fairport, and Carlton Ellsworth of Macedon. The Ellsworth surname is important because it could be a second married name of Letty's mother, or it could be Letty's maiden name in the case that her stepmother remarried and the brothers were from a prior marriage or marriages from Letty's father. These are what I think is the likely best theory as to who the people in the obituary are. So we have Letty Bortle, and we have Eugene Bortle, her husband. We have a stepmother that we're sure that's her name, Mrs. George Bullman. The dashes indicate a theory. So the theory is her father's name is George Bullman. And we also have a number of half-brothers who were listed with the Ellsworth surname. So our theory is that her mother married an Ellsworth, and those are from her mother's second marriage. But there could be other possibilities. And then we have 2 sisters, Mrs. Irene Boyce and Mrs. Martha Moore. We know they're half sisters, but there's not enough clues to know if those are her mother's children or her father's children. When you're looking through newspapers, be sure to check social columns too around the time of a relative's death. If someone from out of town came to stay with a relative to attend the funeral, a visit may be recorded. In this research example, I had lost the mother of Jessie Eberts. Her mother's was named Gwendolyn. Gwendolyn was not listed in either of her daughter's wedding announcements. Her daughter's father was remarried by the time the daughters were married. Gwendolyn was not listed in the New York State Death Index or the New York State Marriage Index as being remarried. No obituary or marriage announcement was found for Gwendolyn searching online newspapers. Eventually, I stumbled upon this small social column entry, which says, Edward A. Downey has returned to his home, 931 Knox Street, after spending the weekend in Rochester as the guest of Miss Jessie Eberts at the home of her mother, Mrs. Fred Geen. Because of this entry, I was able to track Gwendolyn for the rest of her life. 2 databases available through the Buffalo and Erie County Public Library include the newspapers.com obituary index, which includes many Buffalo area newspapers. The database provides the newspaper citation and abstracts important information found in the obituary, such as the examples you see here. We see a burial date, a burial place, the obituary place, different family member names. So let's have a look at Ancestry Library Edition, which is one of the databases that has the newspapers.com index. To access Ancestry Library Edition, you would go to Research and Resources, click Databases A to Z, select Genealogy, and choose Ancestry Library. As you can see from the database description, it says available at all library locations. So Ancestry Library Edition can only be viewed in library, but you can use it at any one of the Buffalo and Erie County Public Library locations. To get to the newspapers.com index, you can go to the search menu, select Card Catalog, and type in newspapers.com obituary in the title field. Then click Search. Here it is. And you can put as much or as little information as you know. So I'm starting with a name, Darwin Martin, the year of death, 1935, and that he lived in Buffalo. The first result looks good, so I'm going to go ahead and click on it. An important thing to note is that a computer makes this index, so it can read the text wrong sometimes. For example, here we see his spouse is listed as Isabel Reed, but her actual surname was Reedpath. And we've got Hiram MC and Anne Elizabeth Manis, and those are his parents' names, but their names were Hiram and Anne Elizabeth McManus. If you click on source, it will tell you what newspaper that came from. So it's the Buffalo Evening News, December 18th, 1935. If you happen to subscribe to newspapers.com, you could go to that link. If you don't, then you could check the library's holdings to see if we have these newspapers on microfilm. The library does not have access to newspapers.com. So to see a list of the newspapers that the library carries, you would go to the library's homepage, click on Research and Resources, go to Special Collections, Guides and Publications, and Newspapers. And you want to click on this one, Buffalo, Western New York, and New York State newspapers. And there'll be an alphabetical listing of the newspapers, and it would tell you what dates we have. And then it would tell you the location. A lot of them you would see would be on microfilm, but sometimes we still have paper versions of the newspaper, and it would say something like boxed or bound. And then if we do have the newspapers you're interested in, you would come into the Grosvenor room at the Central Library, and our staff could help you get those newspapers and use our microfilm machines if they're on microfilm. Some newspapers are online, and this is a list of some places where you could find Buffalo area newspapers. Thank you so much for joining us.